The emergency beacon cut through the silence of deep space like a scream. Commander Sarah Chen felt her stomach drop as the distress signal painted itself across her navigation screen in urgent red letters. The message was brief but chilling. Colony ship Peaceful Dawn under attack. Caliph raiders, children aboard, please help. Marcus Rodriguez didn't need to see the coordinates to know they were headed into hell. He'd fought the Caliph before, back when Earth was still learning that humanity wasn't alone in the galaxy. The six-armed, chitinous nightmares had earned their reputation as the most ruthless species in known space. They took no prisoners, showed no mercy, and had a particular hatred for what they called soft flesh species like humans. "How long until we reach them?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the ice forming in his veins. 47 minutes at maximum burn, Chen replied, her fingers dancing across the control panel. But Marcus, you need to know something. The Peaceful Dawn isn't a military vessel. It's a colony ship carrying 300 families to New Terra. Most of the passengers are civilians. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. 300 families meant children. Lots of children. The Caliph had a sick obsession with proving their superiority by targeting the most vulnerable members of any species they encountered. Human children, with their big eyes and trusting nature, were particularly appealing targets for the aliens' twisted sense of dominance. "What's our tactical situation?" Marcus asked, already knowing the answer would be grim. "We're it," Chen said quietly. "The nearest military patrol is 6 hours away. The Peaceful Dawn has basic defensive shields and maybe a dozen security officers with small arms against a Caliph raiding party." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Marcus looked out at the stars streaming past their small patrol ship. The Defender's Edge was fast and well-armed for its size, but it was designed for reconnaissance and light combat. Taking on a full Caliph raiding force was like bringing a knife to a nuclear war. But those families didn't have 6 hours. They probably didn't have 6 minutes. "Chen, I need you to understand something," Marcus said, turning to face his commanding officer. "I've seen what the Caliph do to prisoners. I've walked through the aftermath of their raids. If we don't try to help those people, there won't be anyone left to save when the cavalry arrives." Sarah Chen had served with Marcus Rodriguez for 3 years. She'd seen him face down pirates, negotiate with hostile alien traders, and keep his cool in situations that would break most people. But she'd never seen the look in his eyes that was there now. It was the expression of a man who had made peace with the possibility of dying, as long as his death might mean something. "The Caliph raiding ships are heavily armored," Chen said, pulling up tactical data on her screen. "Their standard formation uses 3 attack vessels in a triangle pattern. They'll have boarding shuttles and probably twice our firepower." "But they're also predictable," Marcus replied, moving to the weapons console. "Caliph tactics haven't changed in 50 years because they've never needed to. They rely on overwhelming force and intimidation. They're not used to prey that fights back effectively." The minutes crawled by as they raced through space. Marcus ran through every piece of intelligence he could remember about Caliph combat doctrine. They were fierce warriors, but they were also creatures of habit. Their 6 arms made them formidable in close combat, and their chitinous exoskeletons could shrug off small arms fire. But they had weaknesses too. Their ship's power systems had vulnerable junction points, and their boarding tactics followed predictable patterns. "Contact," Chen announced as her sensors lit up with new signals. "I'm reading 4 ships in formation around the * Peaceful Dawn *, 3 Caliph raiders and—" Oh no. "What is it?" "The colony ship is venting atmosphere from multiple hull breaches. They've already been boarded." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. The Caliph were already aboard the civilian vessel, which meant the slaughter had begun. He could picture the scene. Families huddled in terror as 6-armed monsters stalked through the corridors, their mandibles clicking in anticipation of the hunt. "New plan," Marcus said, his voice taking on a hard edge. "We're not going to engage their ships directly. We're going to board the Peaceful Dawn *. "Marcus, that's suicide. Even if we could get past their raiders, the Caliph will have secured the ship. It'll be a death trap." "Maybe, but it's the only chance those civilians have. The Caliph expect their enemies to attack from outside, ship to ship. They won't expect someone to voluntarily enter their killing ground." Chen stared at him for a long moment. "You're serious about this?" "Deadly serious. Can you get us past their perimeter?" Sarah Chen had graduated top of her class from the Naval Academy. She'd studied every major space battle in human history. Everything in her training told her that what Marcus was suggesting was tactical insanity. But she'd also learned to trust the instincts of the man sitting beside her. "I can do it," she said finally. "The peaceful dawn is big enough to mask our approach if I come in from the shadow side. But Marcus, once you're aboard, you'll be on your own. I won't be able to provide support or extract you if things go wrong." "I know. You'll be one man against potentially dozens of Caliph warriors." "I know that too." Chen pulled up the colony ship's blueprints on her screen. The Peaceful Dawn was a massive vessel designed to carry entire communities across the void. Its multiple decks and complex layout would work in Marcus's favor, but it also meant a lot of ground to cover and a lot of places for the enemy to hide. "If I'm doing this, I need to know where the civilians are most likely to be," Marcus said, studying the ship's design. "The Caliph will want to corral them somewhere central for maximum psychological impact." "Probably the main assembly hall on Deck 7, Chen replied, highlighting the area on the display. "It's the largest open space on the ship, and it's where they hold community gatherings, if the Caliph are following their standard pattern." "They'll want an audience for their demonstration of superiority," Marcus finished grimly. "They'll gather as many people as possible in one place to witness whatever sick game they're planning." The distance to the Peaceful Dawn continued to shrink on their display. Marcus began checking his equipment: body armor, assault rifle, sidearm, emergency medical supplies, and the small collection of improvised weapons he'd learned to carry after his first encounter with the Caliph. Most people didn't realize that the aliens' exoskeletons had joints that could be exploited, or that their 6 arms actually created vulnerabilities in their defensive posture if you knew where to strike. "Marcus," Chen said quietly as they approached the point of no return, "I want you to know that what you're doing is either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen, possibly both." "Probably both," Marcus agreed with a tight smile, "but those kids don't have anyone else." The colony ship loomed larger on their screens as they approached. Marcus could see the scorch marks from Caliph weapons along its hull, and the ugly tears where boarding pods had punched through the ship's defenses. Somewhere inside that wounded vessel, families were depending on miracles they didn't even know to hope for. "I'm reading life signs," Chen reported, her voice carefully neutral. "Approximately 200 humans still alive aboard the ship. 200 out of 300. That meant the Caliph had already killed a third of the passengers, probably the security officers and anyone else who had tried to resist." Marcus forced himself not to think about the children who might already be lost. Instead, he focused on the ones he might still be able to save. "There," Chen said, pointing to a service airlock on the colony ship's lower hull. "That access port is in the ship's sensor shadow. I can get you close enough to dock without the Caliph detecting our approach." Marcus stood and secured his gear. Through the viewport, he could see the 3 Caliph raiders maintaining their positions around the Peaceful Dawn asterisk. The alien ships looked like metallic insects, all sharp angles and predatory grace. He'd seen ships like those reduce entire space stations to floating debris. "Chen, once I'm aboard, I need you to withdraw to a safe distance. If this goes wrong, someone needs to survive to warn the fleet about Caliph activity in this sector." "And if it goes right?" Marcus paused at the airlock door. "If it goes right, you'll know because the shooting will stop and I'll call for pickup. But Chen," he turned back to face her one last time, "if you don't hear from me within 2 hours, assume I failed and get word to command. Don't let those families die for nothing." The docking was smooth and silent. Chen's piloting skills got them alongside the colony ship without triggering any alarms. Marcus felt the soft bump as their airlocks connected, followed by the hiss of atmosphere equalizing. On the other side of that door was a ship full of terrified civilians and an unknown number of alien killers. "Airlock sealed and pressurized," Chen reported. "You're good to go." Marcus checked his weapons one final time and cycled the inner door. The corridor beyond was dimly lit and eerily quiet. Emergency lighting cast everything in a red glow that made the shadows seem deeper and more threatening. He could smell the acrid scent of burned electronics and something else, something organic and wrong that made his skin crawl. "I'm aboard," he whispered into his comm unit, beginning sweep toward the main assembly area. As he moved deeper into the ship, Marcus began to find evidence of the Caliph attack. Blast marks on the walls showed where the ship's defenders had made their stand. Personal belongings were scattered in the corridors where families had fled in panic. And in some places, there were dark stains on the deck plates that Marcus tried not to look at too closely. The silence was the worst part. A colony ship carrying 300 people should have been full of sound, conversations, children playing, the hum of everyday life. Instead, there was only the quiet whisper of air through the ventilation system and the distant sound of something that might have been sobbing. Marcus followed the ship's main corridor toward the central assembly area, his rifle ready and his senses on high alert. The Caliph were ambush predators by nature, and their 6 arms made them incredibly dangerous in close quarters. But they were also supremely confident in their superiority, which sometimes made them careless. A sound from ahead made him freeze. It was a clicking noise, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone tapping their fingernails on a hard surface. Marcus had heard that sound before. It was the way Caliph communicated when they were hunting. He pressed himself against the corridor wall and eased forward until he could see around the corner. 2 Caliph warriors stood guard at an intersection, their chitinous forms looking like nightmares come to life. Each was nearly 7 feet tall, with 4 arms ending in razor-sharp claws and 2 more arms holding weapons. Their mandibles clicked constantly as they spoke in their harsh, guttural language. Marcus knew he had only one chance. If he alerted the ship to his presence too early, the Caliph would execute their prisoners before he could reach them. He had to move fast, strike hard, and hope that surprise would be enough to even the odds. He took a deep breath, said a silent prayer for the families somewhere ahead of him, and prepared to step into hell. Marcus moved like death itself through the corridors of the peaceful Dawn Asterisk. The 2 Caliph guards never saw him coming. His knife found the nerve cluster at the base of their skulls before either could raise an alarm. Their chitinous bodies hit the deck with barely a whisper, and Marcus dragged them into an empty storage compartment. As he moved deeper into the ship, the sounds became clearer. Somewhere ahead, he could hear the terrified whimpering of children and the harsh, clicking commands of Caliph voices. The assembly hall was 3 decks up and 2 sections forward. Every step took him closer to a confrontation he knew he probably wouldn't survive. The ship's internal sensors had been damaged in the attack, leaving whole sections in darkness. Marcus used this to his advantage, moving through maintenance passages and emergency corridors that the Caliph wouldn't know about. The colony ship's designers had never imagined their vessel would become a battlefield, but the redundant pathways meant for repairs and emergencies now served as routes for a one-man war. He paused at an access panel and called up the ship's internal monitoring system. Most of the cameras were offline, but a few still functioned. What he saw on the working displays made his blood run cold. The Caliph had indeed gathered the survivors in the main assembly hall, but they weren't just holding them prisoner. They were playing with them. On the screen, Marcus watched as a Caliph warrior grabbed a young boy, maybe 8 years old, and lifted him high in the air. The child's parents screamed and pleaded, while other Caliph held them back with casual, brutal efficiency. The warrior holding the boy wasn't planning to kill him, not yet. This was psychological warfare, designed to break the spirits of the adult humans by threatening their most precious treasures. Marcus counted at least 12 Caliph in the assembly hall, possibly more outside the camera's range. The survivors, maybe 150 people, were clustered in the center of the room like sheep surrounded by wolves. Most were families with children, exactly the sort of soft targets the Caliph preferred for their demonstrations of dominance. A new sound reached his ears, the heavy footsteps of something massive moving through the ship's corridors. Marcus killed the display and pressed himself against the wall as the sound grew closer. When the creature came into view, he had to bite back a curse of pure terror. It was a Caliph warlord, one of the alien species' elite warrior class. Standing nearly 9 feet tall, its exoskeleton was reinforced with metallic plates, and its 6 arms carried an arsenal that could level a building. But it wasn't the weapons that made Marcus's hands shake. It was what the warlord was dragging behind it. A makeshift sled made from torn metal held the bodies of the colony ship's security team. The warlord was taking trophies to the assembly hall, planning to display them in front of the survivors as a demonstration of what resistance would cost them. Marcus had seen this tactic before. The Caliph called it the breaking of spirits, and it was brutally effective at crushing any hope of rebellion among their victims. The warlord passed Marcus's hiding spot without detecting him, but its destination was clear. It was heading for the assembly hall, where it would add psychological torture to the physical terror already being inflicted on the survivors. Marcus knew he was running out of time. Soon, the aliens would tire of their games and begin the systematic execution of their prisoners. He continued through the maintenance passages, using every trick he'd learned in a decade of military service. The ship's emergency supplies included industrial equipment that could be weaponized if someone was desperate enough. Marcus was far beyond desperate. He was operating on pure determination and the knowledge that over 100 innocent people were depending on him to do the impossible. The first improvised explosive device went together quickly. Emergency oxygen canisters, electrical components from damaged systems, and a timer salvaged from the ship's kitchen created a bomb that wouldn't win any awards for elegance, but would definitely get the Calith's attention. Marcus placed it in a secondary corridor, set the timer for 5 minutes, and moved to his next position. The second device was more sophisticated. The colony ship carried industrial fabrication equipment, including plasma cutters and magnetic containment units. With some creative rewiring, Marcus turned a materials processor into something that would have made his old demolitions instructor proud. He placed this one near the ship's power distribution center, where it would cause maximum disruption without endangering the prisoners. As he worked, Marcus could hear the sounds from the assembly hall growing louder. The Calith were becoming more aggressive, their clicking language rising in pitch as they worked themselves into a frenzy. Soon, they would move from psychological torture to physical violence, and once that line was crossed, there would be no saving anyone. The third device was personal. Marcus had carried the components for it ever since his first encounter with the Calith 5 years ago, when he'd been part of a rescue team that arrived too late to save a mining station. The bomb was small, compact, and designed specifically to exploit the one weakness he'd discovered in Calith biology, their reliance on pheromone communication. Calith warriors coordinated through chemical signals as much as vocal ones. Disrupt those signals with the right combination of compounds, and even the most disciplined unit would fall into chaos. The materials came from the ship's medical bay and chemical processing lab. Mixed together with a dispersal charge, they would create confusion that might last just long enough for Marcus to even the odds. The first explosion echoed through the ship right on schedule. Marcus heard the sharp crack of the oxygen canister bomb, followed by the grinding sound of collapsing bulkheads. Emergency alarms began wailing throughout the vessel, adding to the chaos. Through the ship's communication system, he could hear Calith voices raised in surprise and anger. "Unknown explosion in Section C7, he heard one of them report in their harsh language. Marcus had learned enough Calith during his military service to understand basic communications. Investigating possible sabotage. The second bomb went off 90 seconds later, plunging half the ship into darkness as the power distribution center overloaded. Emergency lighting flickered on throughout the vessel, casting everything in an eerie red glow that made the shadows dance like living things. More Calith voices filled the communication channels, their confident commands replaced by confused questions. Marcus was already moving toward the assembly hall when the third device activated. This one didn't explode with the dramatic force of the others. Instead, it released its chemical payload in a nearly silent puff of vapor that spread through the ship's air circulation system. Within minutes, every Calith on board would be breathing air contaminated with synthetic pheromones that would scramble their ability to coordinate and communicate effectively. The corridor outside the assembly hall was chaos. Calith warriors ran in multiple directions, their usual discipline shattered by the sudden attacks on their positions. Marcus counted at least 8 aliens moving through the area, but they were no longer working as a coordinated unit. The pheromone disruption was working better than he'd hoped. He picked off the first warrior with a burst from his rifle, targeting the weak points where its exoskeleton plates joined together. The alien went down in a spray of dark fluid, its 6 arms twitching as its nervous system shut down. The second Calith turned toward the sound of gunfire, but Marcus was already moving, using the emergency lighting's shadows to mask his position. The hand-to-hand fighting was brutal and desperate. Calith warriors were faster and stronger than humans, but Marcus had advantages they didn't expect. Knowledge of their anatomy, weapons designed specifically for close combat with their species, and the kind of desperate fury that came from knowing that innocent children were depending on his success. His combat knife found the nerve cluster under the third warrior's primary arm joint, paralyzing two of its limbs instantly. A plasma grenade took out the fourth alien, but not before its claws raked across Marcus's arm, leaving deep gouges in his body armor. Blood ran down his sleeve, but he ignored the pain and kept moving. The doors to the assembly hall stood before him, sealed and undoubtedly defended. Through the gaps around the frame, he could hear children crying and adults whispering prayers in multiple languages. The Caliph inside would be on high alert now, aware that their ship was under attack but not sure where the threat was coming from. Marcus checked his remaining weapons and ammunition. 2 clips for his rifle, 4 grenades, his sidearm, and the various improvised weapons he'd constructed during his journey through the ship. Against 12 or more Caliph warriors in an enclosed space, it wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. He placed the last of his explosive charges against the door's locking mechanism and stepped back. The blast would announce his arrival to everyone inside, both friend and enemy. Once those doors opened, there would be no retreat, no second chances, and no mercy for anyone who threatened the innocent people inside. The explosion blew the doors inward with a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Marcus went through the opening like an avenging angel, his rifle already firing at the Caliph warriors who turned toward the sound. His first shots took down 2 aliens before they could bring their weapons to bear. His third shot went wide as a Caliph's return fire forced him to dive behind an overturned table. The assembly hall was exactly as horrible as he'd expected. The survivors were herded into the center of the room, surrounded by Caliph warriors whose chitinous forms seemed to absorb the emergency lighting. Bodies lay scattered around the edges of the space, colonists who had tried to resist and paid the ultimate price. The warlord he'd seen earlier stood over a group of children, its massive form a nightmare of armored flesh and cutting edges. "Human," the warlord called out in heavily accented English. "You are alone against the might of the Caliph Empire. Surrender now and we will make your death quick." Marcus responded with a grenade that sent 2 warriors diving for cover. "Counteroffer," he shouted back, reloading his rifle behind his makeshift barricade. "Release the hostages and I'll consider letting some of you live." The warlord's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter. "Foolish, you cannot save them all. Choose which ones die first." To emphasize its point, the massive alien reached down and grabbed a little girl with blonde pigtails, lifting her toward its mandibles. The child's mother screamed and lunged forward, only to be knocked down by another warrior's casual backhand. The message was clear. Marcus could fight, but every moment he delayed meant another innocent death. That was when Marcus smiled for the first time since boarding the ship. The Caliph thought they understood human psychology, but they'd made a critical error. They assumed that threatening children would make him more cautious, more willing to negotiate. Instead, they had just guaranteed that he would show them exactly why humanity had earned its reputation as the most dangerous species in the galaxy when their young were threatened. "You want to see what humans do when you threaten our children?" Marcus said, rising from behind his cover with his rifle trained on the warlord. "Let me show you." The battle in the assembly hall became a nightmare of violence and desperation. Marcus moved like a man possessed, his rifle spitting death at anything with chitinous armor and too many arms. The Caliph warriors, disoriented by the pheromone disruption and caught off guard by his sudden assault, struggled to coordinate their response. His first target was a warrior threatening a family huddled near the wall. 3 precise shots to its joint clusters sent it crashing to the ground, dark fluid spreading across the deck plates. The second warrior turned to engage him, but Marcus was already moving, using the frightened civilians as cover in a way that horrified him but kept him alive. The warlord still held the blonde child, but its grip had shifted as it tried to track Marcus's movement through the chaos. That gave Marcus the opening he needed. A plasma grenade, thrown with desperate accuracy, exploded near the massive alien's feet. The blast didn't kill it, but the shockwave caused it to stagger and release its tiny hostage. "Get the children to the far wall," Marcus shouted to the nearest adults as he dove behind an overturned bench. Bullets and energy bolts filled the air above his head, shattering the emergency lighting and plunging half the room into darkness. "Stay low and move when I give covering fire." The civilians began to move, parents scooping up children and half carrying, half dragging them toward the relative safety of the assembly hall's rear section. Marcus provided cover, his rifle trained on any Caliph that tried to stop the evacuation. 2 more warriors fell to his precise shooting, but his ammunition was running dangerously low. A massive crash shook the entire room as the warlord charged his position, its reinforced exoskeleton shrugging off Marcus's rifle fire like raindrops. 6 arms moved with inhuman speed, each carrying a weapon capable of cutting him in half. Marcus rolled aside just as the warlord's position exploded in a shower of sparks and metal fragments. The improvised weapons he'd constructed during his journey through the ship came into play now. A shaped charge made from ship's components and emergency supplies blew a crater in the deck where the warlord had been standing. The massive alien survived, but its left side was damaged, 2 of its arms hanging useless at its side. "Impossible," the warlord hissed, its voice distorted by pain and rage. "No single human possesses such combat capability." Marcus emerged from cover, his rifle empty but his sidearm ready. Around the room, the surviving Caliph warriors were regrouping, their initial confusion giving way to focused hatred. There were still 7 of them active, plus the wounded warlord. Against 1 human with limited ammunition, those were overwhelming odds. "You're right," Marcus said, backing toward the huddled civilians. "No single human could take on your entire raiding party and win." He ejected his rifle's empty magazine and slapped in his last clip. "But I'm not trying to win, I'm buying time." The warlord's mandibles clicked in confusion. "Time for what? Your rescue ships are hours away." Marcus smiled grimly. "Time for you to realize that you've made a critical error in your calculations." As if summoned by his words, a new sound echoed through the ship's corridors. The heavy footsteps of armored boots, moving with military precision. Voices calling out in human languages, coordinated and professional. The cavalry had arrived, but not in the form the warlord expected. "Security sweep, Section 7, a voice echoed through the ship's communication system. "Multiple hostiles neutralized. Proceed with caution." Marcus had activated the ship's emergency beacon during his journey through the maintenance passages, but he'd set it to broadcast on a specific frequency used by civilian emergency response teams. The signal hadn't reached military ships hours away. It had reached the Peaceful Dawn *S sister ship, the New Horizon *, which had been following the same route at a distance. The second colony ship had responded to the distress call with every able-bodied person who could hold a weapon. Farmers, engineers, teachers, shopkeepers, ordinary people who had decided that they wouldn't abandon their friends and neighbors to alien monsters. They weren't soldiers, but they were humans protecting their own, and that made them dangerous in ways the Caliph couldn't understand. "Your tactical situation has changed," Marcus informed the warlord as the sounds of fighting grew closer. "You're no longer hunting helpless prey. You're trapped on a ship with 300 very angry humans who know you've been threatening their children." The warlord's response was a roar of pure fury. It charged Marcus again, its remaining functional arms swinging weapons in deadly arcs. Marcus met the charge head-on, his sidearm firing until the magazine ran empty, then drew his combat knife for what he knew would be his final stand. The blade found its mark in the warlord's nerve cluster, but the massive alien's momentum carried it forward, slamming into Marcus with bone-crushing force. They went down together in a tangle of arms and weapons, rolling across the deck as they fought for dominance. The warlord's claws raked across Marcus's armor, while his knife searched for vital spots in its chitinous shell. Around them, the remaining Caliph warriors faced a new threat as the assembly hall's secondary entrances burst open. The civilian rescue force poured into the room with makeshift weapons and desperate courage. They weren't trained soldiers, but they had something the aliens couldn't match. They were fighting for their families. A farmer named Daniel Chen took down a Caliph warrior with a plasma cutter modified for combat. A teacher called Maria Santos used her knowledge of alien biology to target weak points with surgical precision. A shopkeeper named Ahmed Hassan turned his inventory management scanner into a targeting system that guided improvised explosives to their targets. The battle became a swirling melee of desperate humans and increasingly panicked aliens. The Caliph had expected easy prey, not a coordinated defense by people willing to die rather than watch their children suffer. Their formation collapsed as civilian fighters attacked from multiple angles, using teamwork and determination to overcome superior individual strength. Marcus felt his strength fading as he wrestled with the warlord. Blood loss and exhaustion were taking their toll, but he held on with grim determination. If he could keep the massive alien busy for just a few more seconds, the civilians might finish mopping up the rest of its warriors. The end came suddenly. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the ship's chief medical officer, appeared beside the struggling pair with a medical scanner in one hand and a plasma scalpel in the other. Her knowledge of anatomy, both human and alien, guided her as she made a single, precise cut that severed the warlord's spinal column at exactly the right point. The massive alien went limp, its 4 functional arms falling to the deck with wet thuds. Marcus rolled away from the corpse, gasping for air and trying to assess the damage to his own body. Around the assembly hall, the sounds of combat were dying away as the last Caliph warriors fell to the determined assault of the civilian defenders. "Is anyone hurt?" Dr. Warren called out, already moving to check on the hostages who had been freed during the battle. "I need all medical personnel to report for triage immediately." Marcus struggled to his feet, using the wall for support. His armor was cracked in multiple places, and he could feel blood seeping from wounds he didn't remember receiving. But he was alive, and more importantly, so were the children. Most of them, anyway. The thought of those who hadn't survived the initial attack hit him like a physical blow. "You did it," said a voice beside him. Marcus turned to see Sarah Chen, his commanding officer from the Defenders Edge Asterisk. She must have come aboard with the rescue force, probably leading them through the ship's corridors to reach the assembly hall. "We did it," Marcus corrected, looking around at the civilians who were tending to the wounded and comforting the traumatized children. "These people saved themselves. I just bought them time to organize." Chen followed his gaze to where Daniel Chen was helping reunite families, where Maria Santos was using her teacher's voice to calm frightened children, where Ahmed Hassan was coordinating the search for any remaining Caliph throughout the ship. These weren't soldiers, but they had fought like veterans when their loved ones were threatened. "The Caliph have been broadcasting their attack on this ship throughout their empire," Chen said quietly. "They wanted to use it as propaganda to show other species what happens when they resist Caliph expansion." Marcus nodded wearily. He'd seen alien propaganda before. The Caliph used fear as a weapon, spreading videos of their atrocities to discourage resistance before they ever fired a shot. It was brutally effective psychological warfare. Instead, Chen continued with a slight smile, they've just broadcast something very different. They've shown the galaxy what happens when humans are cornered and fighting for their children. The footage of ordinary civilians taking down trained Caliph warriors is already spreading through every communication network in known space. Around them, the assembly hall was transforming from a battlefield back into a place where families gathered. Children who had been silent with terror were beginning to speak again, comforted by parents who had never expected to see them alive. The wounded were being treated, the dead were being honored, and slowly, carefully, the business of survival was resuming. Marcus watched a little girl with blonde pigtails, the same child the warlord had threatened earlier, as she drew pictures with crayons someone had found for her. Instead of monsters or violence, she was drawing spaceships and stars, already looking forward to the new world her family would build when they reached New Terra. "The Caliph think they understand humanity," Marcus said to Chen, as medical personnel finally convinced him to sit down for treatment. "They study our military capabilities, our weapons, our tactics, but they don't understand what makes us really dangerous." "What's that?" Marcus gestured toward the families reuniting around them, toward the civilians who had dropped everything to rescue people they'd never met, toward the children who were already beginning to heal from trauma that would have broken adults of most species. "We're dangerous because we don't fight for territory or resources or dominance," he said. "We fight for each other, and when you threaten our children, there's no force in the universe that can stop us from fighting back." Dr. Warren appeared at his elbow with medical supplies and a stern expression. "Commander Rodriguez, you need immediate treatment for multiple lacerations, possible internal bleeding, and severe exhaustion. I'm ordering you to report to the medical bay." Marcus started to protest, but Chen cut him off. "That's an order, Marcus. You've done enough for one day." As they helped him toward the medical bay, Marcus took one last look around the assembly hall. The Caliph bodies were being removed, the damaged equipment was being repaired, and families were already planning their continued journey to New Terra. In a few hours, this would just be another chapter in the colony's history, a story parents would tell their children about the day ordinary people did extraordinary things. But Marcus knew it was more than that. Today, humanity had sent a message to the galaxy, written in Calith blood and civilian courage. The message was simple: threaten our children at your own peril, because we will find you, we will stop you, and we will make sure you never threaten anyone again. The stars outside the viewports continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the struggles of the mortals who traveled between them. But somewhere in the darkness, other species were receiving the recordings of what had happened aboard the peaceful Dawn Asterisk. They were learning that humanity's reputation for protective fury wasn't just propaganda or posturing. It was a promise. 3 weeks after the battle aboard the peaceful Dawn Asterisk, Marcus Rodriguez sat in a hospital bed on Kepler Station, watching news feeds from across the galaxy. The footage of civilian defenders fighting off Calith raiders had indeed spread through every communication network in known space, but the consequences were far more significant than anyone had anticipated. Dr. Elizabeth Warren entered his room carrying a tablet full of medical readouts and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose patient was finally cooperating with treatment. "Your internal injuries are healing well," she announced, checking the displays beside his bed. "The nanobotic repair systems have sealed the worst of the damage, and your bone density is returning to normal." Marcus shifted uncomfortably against his pillows. 3 weeks of forced bed rest had been harder on him than the actual battle. "When can I return to active duty?" "When I say you can," Warren replied firmly. "You lost nearly 40% of your blood volume during that fight, sustained multiple fractures, and pushed your body beyond its normal limits. The fact that you're alive at all is something of a medical miracle." On the news feed, an alien correspondent was interviewing survivors from the peaceful dawn. Marcus recognized Daniel Chen, the farmer who had turned a plasma cutter into an anti-Calith weapon. The man was explaining in simple, matter-of-fact terms how ordinary colonists had organized their defense against trained alien warriors. "We didn't have military training," Chen was saying to the interviewer's translator. "We just had children to protect. When someone threatens your children, you don't think about odds or tactics. You think about making them stop." The interview cut to Maria Santos, the teacher who had used her knowledge of alien biology to target Calith weak points. She was surrounded by some of the children from the colony ship, including the blonde girl with pigtails who had been threatened by the warlord. "The children asked me why the bad aliens wanted to hurt them," Santos said, her voice steady but her eyes showing the strain of recent trauma. "I tell them that some creatures in the universe think being cruel makes them strong, but we showed them they were wrong. Protecting others is what makes us strong." Marcus smiled despite his pain. The little girl was drawing again, her crayons moving across paper with the focused concentration that only children could manage. This time, she was drawing people helping each other, families working together to build something beautiful among the stars. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Sarah Chen entered carrying a stack of official-looking documents and wearing the expression of someone who had spent too many hours in bureaucratic meetings. "How's our hero feeling?" she asked, settling into the chair beside his bed. "Like someone who's tired of being called a hero," Marcus replied. "What's the official word from command?" Chen's expression grew serious. "That's complicated. The Calith Empire has filed formal protests with the Galactic Council, claiming that the attack on their raiders was an act of aggression by human military forces." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Military forces?" "According to their version of events, the peaceful dawn was defended by heavily armed human special forces using advanced weapons and tactical coordination. They're claiming that the entire incident was a setup designed to make them look weak." "That's ridiculous. The footage clearly shows civilian defenders using improvised weapons and desperate courage." "The footage also shows something the Calith don't want to admit," Chen said with a slight smile. "It shows their elite warriors being defeated by farmers, teachers, and shopkeepers. That's not a narrative they can afford to have spreading through their empire." On the news feed, the scene had shifted to an analysis segment featuring military experts from multiple species. A Vulnarian tactical specialist was explaining how the human defense had violated every principle of conventional warfare while somehow achieving total victory. "The humans showed no concern for proper formation or fire discipline," the expert was saying through its translator. "They attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, used improvised weapons with no standardized training, and coordinated through nothing more than shared determination. By all military doctrine, they should have been easily defeated. Yet they weren't, the interviewer noted. No, they adapted faster than their opponents could respond. When conventional weapons weren't available, they improvised new ones. When their positions were overrun, they fell back and regrouped. When their enemies tried to break their morale by threatening children, they became more dangerous, not less. Marcus muted the sound and turned back to Chen. What does this mean for the colony ships? Are they going to be safe reaching New Terra? That's where things get interesting, Chen said, consulting her documents. The Caliph Empire has officially declared human space off-limits to their raiding fleets. They're calling it a temporary tactical adjustment, but intelligence suggests they're genuinely concerned about further encounters with human civilian defenders. They're afraid of farmers and teachers. They're afraid of what farmers and teachers become when their children are threatened. The footage from the peaceful dawn has been analyzed by every military academy in known space. The consensus is that humans represent a unique threat in the galaxy. Chen pulled up a tactical analysis on her tablet and showed it to Marcus. The document was marked with classification levels he hadn't seen since his Special Forces days, but the conclusions were written in language anyone could understand. Most species fight until they calculate that the cost of continuing exceeds the potential benefit, she read aloud. Humans appear to possess a psychological trigger that reverses this calculation when offspring are threatened. Instead of becoming more risk-averse, they become more aggressive. Instead of seeking to minimize losses, they seek to maximize damage to the threat source. Marcus nodded slowly. We don't fight cost-benefit analyses when our kids are in danger. We fight until the threat is eliminated or we're dead. Exactly, and that's not a mentality the Caliph know how to counter. Their entire tactical doctrine is based on psychological intimidation and overwhelming force. When intimidation makes their enemies more dangerous instead of more compliant, they don't have a backup plan. The door opened again to admit Admiral Catherine Hayes, commander of the 7th Fleet and one of the most decorated officers in human military history. Marcus started to struggle upright, but she waved him back down. Stay put, Commander. You've earned the right to receive visitors lying down. She settled into another chair and fixed him with the kind of stare that had made admirals out of captains and legends out of admirals. We need to talk. Chen excused herself, leaving Marcus alone with the admiral. Hayes waited until the door closed before speaking again. The incident aboard the Peaceful Dawn has created what the intelligence community calls a paradigm shift in galactic politics, she said without preamble. Every major species is reassessing their relationship with humanity based on what happened there. Is that good or bad? Both. The Caliph Empire is backing down from their expansion plans in our direction, which is excellent news for our colonies. But other species are starting to view humans as potentially unstable allies. When your response to threat escalation is to escalate even further, it makes people nervous. Marcus thought about the families aboard the Peaceful Dawn asterisk, about children drawing pictures of stars and parents planning new lives on distant worlds. Are we supposed to apologize for protecting our children? Hell no, Hayes said with surprising vehemence. What you and those civilians did was exactly right. The problem is that not everyone sees it that way. The Galactic Council is calling for moderation and proportional responses to future incidents. Meaning they want us to fight like civilized beings instead of like humans. Hayes leaned forward in her chair. That's why I'm here, Rodriguez. Command is forming a new unit, designed specifically to respond to threats against human civilian populations. We need someone who understands what ordinary people are capable of when they're fighting for their families. Marcus studied the Admiral's face. You want me to train civilian defenders? I want you to lead them. The new unit will be called Civilian Protection Command, and it will have authority to respond to any threat against human noncombatants anywhere in known space. You'll have the resources to train colonial defenders, coordinate with local security forces, and deploy rapid response teams when needed. The offer was tempting. Marcus thought about Daniel Chen learning to modify plasma cutters into weapons, about Maria Santos using her teacher's skills to coordinate battlefield medicine, about Ahmed Hassan turning his shopkeeper's inventory system into a targeting computer. Those people had fought with courage born of desperation, but with proper training and equipment, they could become something truly formidable. "What about the Galactic Council's concerns about proportional responses?" he asked. Hayes smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "The Galactic Council can file all the protests they want. When someone threatens human children, proportional response means we keep killing them until they stop. If that makes us uncivilized in their eyes, so be it." Marcus looked back at the news feed, where the little girl with blonde pigtails was showing her drawings to the camera. Her pictures showed families building homes among alien stars, children playing in gardens under foreign suns, and people working together to create something beautiful in the vast darkness between worlds. "When do I start?" he asked. "As soon as Dr. Warren clears you for duty," Hayes replied. "But Rodriguez, I need you to understand what you're signing up for. This isn't going to be a traditional military command. You'll be working with civilians who have jobs and families and lives they want to get back to. They're not professional soldiers." "No," Marcus agreed, thinking about the farmers and teachers and shopkeepers who had fought beside him in the assembly hall. "There's something better. They're people with something to protect." Hayes stood to leave, then paused at the door. "The Caliph made one fundamental error in their assessment of human psychology," she said. "They assumed that threatening our children would make us more cautious, more willing to negotiate. Instead, they taught the galaxy that humans are most dangerous when we have the most to lose." After the Admiral left, Marcus returned his attention to the news feeds. The story of the peaceful dawn was still spreading, picked up by media outlets across known space, and analyzed by everyone from military historians to xenopsychologists. But the most important coverage wasn't coming from professional journalists. Individual families were recording their own messages, broadcast through personal communication networks to relatives and friends throughout human space. Parents were talking about what they would do if someone threatened their children. Farmers were discussing how agricultural equipment could be modified for defense. Teachers were sharing lessons about alien biology with their students. Without any official coordination or military planning, civilian populations throughout human space were spontaneously organizing their own defense networks. Community groups were forming training programs. Technical colleges were offering courses in improvised weapons construction. Parent-teacher associations were hosting lectures on xenobiology and combat first aid. The galaxy had learned something about humanity from the events aboard the peaceful Dawn Asterisk. But humanity was learning something about itself too. When their children were threatened, they didn't just fight back, they made sure it would never happen again. Marcus smiled as he watched a group of colonial teenagers explaining to a news camera how they'd turned their science fair projects into early warning systems for alien raiders. The kids were excited and proud, showing off their work with the enthusiasm that only young people could manage. "We're not waiting for someone else to protect us," one of them said to the interviewer. "We're learning to protect ourselves, and if anyone tries to hurt our families, they're going to find out what humans do when you threaten the people we love." The stars outside the station's viewports continued their ancient dance, but the space between them was no longer the same. Somewhere in that darkness, alien civilizations were reconsidering their expansion plans and reassessing their strategic calculations. They had learned that humans were most dangerous when they appeared most vulnerable, most united when they were most threatened. It was a lesson the galaxy would not soon forget. 2 years after the incident aboard the peaceful Dawn Asterisk, Commander Marcus Rodriguez stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed Civilian Protection Command headquarters, watching training exercises take place in the space around Kepler Station. What he saw would have seemed impossible to most military strategists, but it had become the new reality of human space defense. A converted cargo hauler was practicing evasive maneuvers while its crew, a mixed group of miners, engineers, and shop owners from the Tau Ceti colonies, coordinated point defense systems they had built themselves. Their movements were unorthodox by military standards, but devastatingly effective against the simulated attack patterns they faced. "Exercise complete," announced Captain Sarah Chen over the communication system. She had taken command of the training division when Marcus was promoted to head the entire Civilian Protection Command. Defender Group 7 returned to dock for debriefing. Marcus smiled as he watched the converted freighter dock with practiced precision. 2 years ago, most of its crew had been ordinary civilians with no combat experience. Now they were part of a network that spanned human space, linking every colony and settlement in a web of mutual defense that had transformed the strategic balance of the entire sector. Dr. Elizabeth Warren joined him at the observation window, carrying the usual stack of reports that seemed to follow her everywhere. As Chief Medical Officer for the Civilian Protection Command, she had developed training protocols that allowed ordinary people to provide battlefield medicine in crisis situations. The Centauri colonies finished their certification exercises last week, she reported, consulting her tablet. 47 new medical teams qualified for emergency response deployment. That brings our total to over 3,000 trained civilian medical personnel across all human settlements. What about the new Terra situation? Marcus asked. The Peaceful Dawn had finally reached its destination and established the colony as planned, but recent intelligence suggested that other species were watching the new settlement with considerable interest. The colonists there have exceeded all our training benchmarks, Warren said with obvious pride. Daniel Chen has been teaching agricultural modification techniques to settlements throughout the sector. Maria Santos developed an educational curriculum that's being used in civilian defense programs on 40 different worlds. Marcus nodded, remembering the farmer and teacher who had fought beside him in the assembly hall. They had become symbols of something larger than themselves, proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when their families were at stake. And the little girl who was threatened by the warlord. Warren's expression softened. Emily Richardson is 12 now, and according to her latest school reports, she's planning to study xenobiology and interspecies relations. She says she wants to help people understand each other better so that what happened to her family never happens to anyone else. The door to the observation deck opened to admit Admiral Catherine Hayes, who had made the journey from Fleet Headquarters specifically to review the Civilian Protection Command's progress. Her expression was unreadable as she joined them at the window. The Galactic Council met in emergency session yesterday, she announced without preamble. The topic was what they're calling the human-civilian militarization phenomenon. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. The Galactic Council had been growing increasingly concerned about humanity's response to the Peaceful Dawn asterisk incident. Other species were struggling to understand why humans had armed and trained their civilian populations instead of simply increasing military patrols. What's their position? He asked. Mixed. The Caliph Empire is demanding that we demobilize our civilian defense networks, claiming they represent a threat to galactic stability. Several other species support them, arguing that armed civilian populations violate the principles of proportional response to security threats. And the others? Hayes smiled grimly. The others are quietly asking us to help them establish similar programs for their own colonies. Apparently, 3 pirate attacks and 2 attempted slave raids have been stopped by civilian defenders using techniques learned from our training materials. Warren looked up from her reports. Are we sharing our methods with other species? Selectively, Hayes replied. The Vulnarians and the Session Collective have signed formal agreements to participate in joint civilian defense exercises. The Andromedan Trade Federation is sending observers to our next major training event. Through the observation window, they watched another exercise begin. This time, a group of colonial teenagers was demonstrating an early warning system they had designed using nothing more than standard communication equipment and improvised sensor arrays. Their creation could detect incoming ships hours before military-grade systems, and they had built it for less than 1,000th the cost of professional equipment. The teenagers worry me, Marcus admitted. They're treating this like a game, but the skills they're learning are deadly serious. That's exactly why they're so effective, Hayes pointed out. They don't have preconceived notions about what's impossible. When you tell them to build a planetary defense grid using spare parts and teenage ingenuity, they just start building. A new signal appeared on the communication board, marked with the priority codes that meant urgent news from the frontier. Marcus activated the display and read the message that appeared, his expression growing increasingly grim as he processed the information. What is it? Chen asked, nodding his change in demeanor. Long-range scouts have detected a hegemony exploration fleet moving toward the Orion settlements, Marcus said. 12 ships, including heavy assault carriers. The hegemony was a confederation of species that had been expanding aggressively toward human space for the past year. Unlike the Caliph, who relied on terror tactics and quick strikes, the hegemony preferred overwhelming force and systematic conquest. They had never directly confronted human forces, but intelligence suggested they viewed humanity's civilian defense networks as a weakness rather than a strength. The Orion settlements have a total population of maybe 50,000, Warren said, checking her records. Most of them are recent colonists, still establishing their basic infrastructure. What's their defensive capability? Hayes asked. Marcus consulted the tactical database. No military garrison, minimal orbital defenses, but they've completed our basic civilian protection training. According to their last report, they have organized defense teams covering all major population centers. 50,000 colonists against 12 hegemony warships, Chen said quietly. Even with our training, those aren't good odds. Hayes was already reaching for her communication device. I'm ordering the Third Fleet to move toward Orion, but they won't arrive for at least 6 days, if the hegemony attacks before then. Then we'll see what 2 years of training has really accomplished, Marcus finished. He activated the emergency communication network that linked all civilian defense groups across human space. This is Commander Rodriguez, Civilian Protection Command. We have a code-red situation developing in the Orion sector. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Offers of assistance poured in from every human settlement within range. Farmers volunteered to abandon their harvests to crew improvised warships. Engineers offered to modify civilian vessels for combat. Teachers organized medical teams to treat potential casualties. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. The New Terra colony, where survivors of the peaceful dawn had finally established their new home, sent a message that appeared on every screen in the command center. This is Daniel Chen, speaking for the New Terra Colonial Defense Council, the familiar voice said. We're launching the Asterisk Memorial Dawn and 17 escort vessels to assist the Orion settlements. We'll arrive in 4 days. Marcus stared at the message in amazement. The Asterisk Memorial Dawn was a converted colony ship that the New Terra settlers had transformed into a mobile defense platform. Named in honor of those who had died during the Caliph attack, it represented everything the Civilian Protection Command had tried to achieve. They're going to reach Orion before the fleet, Warren observed. They're going to reach Orion before the hegemony, Chen corrected. According to these projections, the civilian defenders will be in position to engage the enemy a full day before military support arrives. Hayes studied the tactical display with the expression of someone who had spent decades planning military operations. Rodriguez, I need you to understand what we're looking at here. 18 civilian vessels, crewed by farmers and shopkeepers and schoolteachers, are about to face down a hegemony assault fleet. I know. If they fail, the Orion colonies will be destroyed, and the hegemony will have proof that human civilian defenders are no match for professional military forces. It'll undermine everything we've built over the past 2 years. And if they succeed? Hayes smiled for the first time since entering the observation deck. If they succeed, every species in the galaxy will know that threatening human civilians means facing the entire human population. Not just our military, not just our government, but every farmer, teacher, shopkeeper, and teenager who has decided that protecting their neighbors is more important than their own safety. The next 4 days passed in a blur of activity. The command center maintained constant communication with the civilian fleet racing toward Orion, while military units scrambled to provide whatever support they could from their distant positions. Intelligence reports tracked the hegemony fleet's approach, confirming that the alien force was indeed composed of 12 heavy warships carrying enough firepower to devastate multiple star systems. On the morning of the 5th day, the 2 fleets met in space above Orion's primary world. Marcus watched the engagement unfold through long-range sensors and communication intercepts, his hands clenched as he followed the battle that would determine the future of human civilian defense. The hegemony fleet attacked in perfect formation, their tactics textbook examples of overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. The civilian defenders responded with chaos that somehow achieved perfect coordination. Ships broke formation to pursue individual targets, modified weapons fired in patterns that defied military doctrine, and improvised tactics created opportunities that professional strategists would never have considered. Memorial Dawn is engaging the Hegemony flagship, reported the communication officer monitoring the battle. They're using some kind of modified mining charges as torpedoes. Civilian escort vessels are coordinating point defense, another officer added. Their pattern recognition software is outperforming Hegemony countermeasures. The battle lasted 3 hours. When it ended, 7 Hegemony warships had been destroyed or disabled, and the remaining 5 were in full retreat. The civilian fleet had suffered casualties, 2 escort vessels lost and several others damaged, but they had achieved something unprecedented in galactic military history. A force of converted civilian ships had defeated a professional military fleet through nothing more than determination, creativity, and the absolute conviction that their neighbors' children deserved protection. Orion control to all human vessels, came the message from the planet below. The colonies are secure. Repeat, the colonies are secure, thank you. But the real message had already been sent, broadcast through communication networks that reached every corner of known space. The recording of the battle, with civilian defenders improvising tactics and weapons to protect complete strangers, became the most watched military engagement in galactic history. Marcus stood at the observation window, watching new groups of civilian trainees arrive for their certification exercises. The volunteers came from every human settlement, every profession, every age group that could legally participate in defense activities. They came because they had learned something that the peaceful dawn had first demonstrated and that the Battle of Orion had confirmed. Humanity was most dangerous when its children were threatened, most united when its neighbors needed help, and most creative when conventional solutions weren't enough. They fought not for territory or resources or political advantage, but for the simple principle that innocent people deserved protection from those who would do them harm. The Hegemony has requested diplomatic talks, Hayes announced, joining him at the window. They want to discuss peaceful coexistence and mutual non-aggression agreements. Marcus smiled, thinking of Emily Richardson studying xenobiology so she could help people understand each other, of Daniel Chen teaching farming techniques that included defensive applications, of Maria Santos developing educational curricula that prepared children to protect themselves and their communities. Good, he said. Maybe they'll learn what every other species in the galaxy is starting to understand. What's that? Marcus gestured toward the trainees below. Ordinary people learning extraordinary skills because they believed their neighbor's safety was worth any sacrifice. That humans don't just protect our own children, we protect everyone's children, and if you threaten them, you'll discover exactly what that means. The stars outside continued their ancient dance, but the space between them had become a different place. Where once there had been scattered human settlements vulnerable to any predator with sufficient firepower, there was now a network of communities linked by shared purpose and mutual protection. The galaxy had learned to fear humanity's protective instincts, but more importantly, it had learned to respect them. And in space stations and colonies throughout human territory, children drew pictures of stars and spaceships and families building better worlds together, secure in the knowledge that ordinary people would do extraordinary things to keep them safe. The monster had been defied, the cubs were protected, and the promise of human space stretched toward infinity.